charmer. Don't believe a word he says. He's just a charmer.
Oh, here it is. There we go. Sorry. So we've got 3 sections here for this class. We're going to do a little section on meditation, another section on Jungian astrology, and then we're going to get to Stephen's question about, are there really these extra dimensions? Do we really need them? Who's kidding who? And that'll be the class.
And what makes anybody think they're actually there?
Yeah, yeah. So here we go. We're gonna start off. I found I thought a nice little YouTube video that's put it on the website.
We've got quite a library.
Yeah, now, so this is called, it's a TED Talk. All of these have had like 1 million views. The one down here in the corner that we're gonna try and do at some point has 15 million views. So anyway, here we go with this one, which is how mindfulness changes the emotional settings. Here we go.
I'm a psychologist and a neuroscientist by training. When I first began my career, I began with a question. Why is it that some people are more vulnerable to life's slings and arrows and others more resilient? And that question is still central to all the work that we do. And we are particularly interested in how we can nudge people along this continuum to nourish and nurture the qualities that promote human flourishing. In the early part of my career, I focused almost exclusively on the negative side of the equation, on adversity, on the brain circuits that were important for understanding why some people are more vulnerable to stress, why others may be more likely to develop a depression or anxiety. And then something very significant happened in my life. In 1992, I first met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And this picture of His Holiness was taken in Madison, Wisconsin. And he's visited us several times. And he was the chief inspiration in our turning toward the positive. And in that critical moment in 1992, he challenged me and he said, why can't you use the same tools of modern neuroscience to study kindness and to study compassion in addition to studying anxiety and fear and depression and stress? And I didn't have a very good answer for him on that day, other than that it's hard. But you know, when we first began to study kindness, when we first began to study anxiety and depression, that was hard too, and we've made some progress in that area. So the work that we and others have been doing is predicated on a critical insight in modern science, the insight concerning neuroplasticity. Our brains are constantly changing, constantly being shaped by the forces around us. But we have typically very little awareness of what those forces are. Our brains are changing wittingly or unwittingly. Most of the time it's unwittingly. Most of the time we're not aware, and we also have little control over those forces. And the invitation in the work that I'm sharing with you today is that we can actually take more responsibility for our own brains by transforming our minds. But first, let me share with you what some of the consequences of having our brains being shaped unwittingly are. And I'd like to focus on 4 challenges that have been critical in our society today. And these challenges are failures of well-being in very important ways. The first is distractibility. Research indicates that if we take people out and about in the world and we text them, and this has been done in a study that was published a number of years ago, very influential study with several thousand people. We text them and we ask them 3 questions. The first question is, What are you doing right now? And they check off from a list of activities. Second question, where is your mind right now? Is it focused on what you're doing, or is it focused elsewhere? And the third question is, at this very moment, how happy or unhappy are you? Here's what was found. The average American adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what we're doing. Folks, we could do better. And when they were not paying attention to what they're doing, they were significantly less happy. The scientific paper upon which this is based was titled, "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." In addition, there is a huge increase in the incidence of attention deficit disorders in children in this country. This is a graph showing a trend over the last decade. There are many reasons for this increase, but some of them have to do with a genuine increase in distractibility. If we're all honest with ourselves, our nation is suffering not simply from a fiscal deficit, but from an attention deficit. We also are suffering from loneliness. Despite the fact that we're all so much more interconnected, 76% of middle-aged Americans report that they have moderate to high levels of loneliness. And this loneliness is not an ephemeral, subjective state. It also impacts our bodies, our physical health. Recent research shows that loneliness is actually a more significant predictor by more than a twofold magnitude of early mortality compared to obesity. So this exacts real tolls on our brains and our bodies. And again, research shows we can do better. Negative self-talk and depression, we all have a narrative in our mind that we carry around about who we are. And sometimes we have negative beliefs about ourselves, which can culminate in depression. And this turns out to be a very serious problem. Depression is on the rise. If you look at trends just over the last few years, what you see is a very large increase, particularly among women. Over the last 3 years alone, there's been a 33% increase in diagnoses of major depression in women. And this trend is occurring in teens as well. These are disturbing trends in kids ages 12 through 17, and the gender difference also is very, unfortunately, robust, where the incidence is much greater in females, and this trend is getting worse over time. And again, the evidence suggests that we can actually train our mind and harness the power of neuroplasticity to change these qualities in our mind. Suicide rates are very disturbing. During the Great Depression, there was a huge elevation, and those rates have come back down. And then since the year 2000, there has been, unfortunately, a steep rise in suicide rates. And again, this is not something restricted to adults. Our teens are showing more than doubling over the last 10 years in suicide, so that today in the United States, unfortunately, more than one teenager every single day is taking her or his own life. There also is a pervasive loss of meaning and purpose that people are reporting. And this loss is not simply, again, a subjective quality, but also exacts a toll on our health and other aspects of our well-being. Research shows that a lack of purpose predicts an early death. In a recent study, people who are in their 60s with a low sense of purpose had more than twice the likelihood of dying within 5 years compared to people who reported a high sense of purpose. So again, there are intimate connections between our psychological well-being and our systemic health. Each of these challenges affects the mind and the brain. We're not thriving, but the invitation is that we really could be. So we've developed a framework for understanding a healthy mind. And this framework includes 4 pillars. The first pillar is awareness. And awareness includes the capacity to focus our attention, to resist distraction. It also includes a quality that psychologists and neuroscientists call meta-awareness. Meta-awareness is knowing what our minds are doing. How many of you have ever had the experience of reading a book where you're reading each word on a page, and you read one page, you may read a second page, and after a few minutes, you have absolutely no idea what you've just read? That is an example of a lapse in meta-awareness. But the moment we recognize that we've been lost and come back, that is a moment of meta-awareness. And we have reason to believe that meta-awareness is crucial. Actually, it's necessary, we believe, for real transformation to occur. The second pillar of a healthy mind is connection. Connection refers to those qualities which nurture harmonious interpersonal relationships. Qualities like appreciation, like kindness, like compassion, having a positive outlook. And again, the research shows that it doesn't take much to start activating these latent qualities which can flourish and become stronger. The third pillar of a healthy mind is insight. And insight is about insight into the narrative that we all have about ourselves. At the very extreme end of the continuum, there are people who have a very negative narrative. They have negative self-beliefs, and they hold those beliefs to be a true description of who they are. That is a prescription for depression. And a healthy mind entails changing our relationship to this narrative. Not so much changing the narrative itself, but changing our relationship to it, so that we can look at the narrative and see it for what it is. What is this narrative? It's a constellation of thoughts. And when we can see it as that, we can foster more room, more breathing room, and this leads to increased well-being. Finally, the last pillar of a healthy mind is purpose. And here we're talking about having a sense that our life is headed in a particular direction. And most importantly, it is about taking more and more of the activities in our lives as belonging to this sense of purpose. Can you envision living your life so that taking out the garbage and doing the laundry is still related to your sense of purpose? Being able to broaden it in this way is a very crucial ingredient of a healthy mind. Have you ever trained your mind? Research from neuroscience leads us to understand that there are 2 fundamentally different kinds of learning. One form of learning we call declarative learning, which is learning about things. I can learn the value of kindness by sitting down and studying texts about kindness, but this won't necessarily lead us to become kinder. We can teach people the value of honesty, but this will not necessarily make them an honest person. In order to cultivate these qualities, we need a second form of learning, and that is called procedural learning. Neuroscience teaches us that these kinds of learning operate through totally different brain circuits. We need both to produce real transformation. The wiring in our brains is not fixed, it's adaptable, and we can harness the power of neuroplasticity to change our brain. Let me give you one example. This is an example from research that we did where we randomized people to a group that received compassion training for 2 weeks, another group that received training from cognitive therapy. We put people in the MRI scanner before and after the 2 weeks of training. And lo and behold, we see systematic differences after just 7 hours of practice. Our brains can change in a remarkably rapid period of time. The changes that are displayed here are changes in the circuit that involve the prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, a circuit very important for certain kinds of positive emotions, which gets strengthened after just this short amount of practice. So these and other kinds of data indicate that the brain really can change quite quickly. It doesn't mean that these changes will last, but it means that they can occur, they can begin, and with systematic practice, they will endure. We view this as an urgent public health need. So we need to start someplace. I would recommend 3 minutes a day. When human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And yet, today, we all do. This is not part of our genome. This is a learned behavior. And it doesn't take much to start these mechanisms in the brain to change. So we can do this when we're doing other things. We can do this while we're commuting. We can do this as we're literally brushing our teeth. We can do this as we're having our first cup of coffee or tea in the morning. We can do this as we're walking. This can be incorporated in routines of our daily life. So we can nourish our mind, and through it, we can change the world. We can reduce implicit bias that gets under the skin. This is something that we've shown can occur with strengthening connection. We can increase school achievement. We've and others have shown this with training and awareness. We can reduce healthcare costs potentially by cultivating well-being, as the connections that I've illustrated show. We can cultivate a strong sense of purpose, we can reduce distraction, and we can increase productivity and focus. And I'd like to end with just a 1 minute short period of practice to give you an experiential taste of this. So if you all just sit for a moment, put down your pens and devices, and I invite you to bring a loved one into your mind and your heart. You can leave your eyes open or closed. And for those who are viewing this online, please share this 1 minute with us. And as you bring this loved one into your mind and your heart, cultivate the strong aspiration that they be happy and be free of suffering. And they share the same wish for happiness and the same wish to be free of suffering as all human beings. And you can envision a time in their life when they may have been having some difficulty, and you can say a simple phrase in your mind: may you be happy, may you be free of suffering. And simply notice whatever may come up for you. And then we can do this for many categories of people, including a difficult person. So I invite you to join us on this journey, and the very future of humanity, we think, depends on it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so there you have it. I thought that was a good introduction. We're going to go back to our book, Radically Happy. And I'm just going to go through in these different classes, just different sections of the book. So the very first section is
There's no particular order.
in that order. The looking for happiness conundrum, okay? And so the looking for a happiness conundrum, the first thing you come up with here is radical happiness is not found in situations and things. It isn't. You're caught up in something that is actually quite deep, and that's why they wrote this book. A different point to keep in mind is that a lot of us do not even know how to enjoy ourselves. That is, what are you really happy? As they observe, most people seem to be miserable. Okay, we aren't very good at predicting what will make us happy. If and when we do seem to get it right, and we do manage to create all the right circumstances for happiness, we nonetheless find it's difficult for us to fully enjoy them. Either we become preoccupied with prolonging them or unhappy at their fleeting nature. And what first makes us happy becomes in turn the very basis for future discontent. Here's a quote from the Buddha: "Do not think about the past, nor start thinking about the future, but leave the mind in the present moment." And here's a quote from Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche: "The very basis of our discontentment is our ongoing and never-ending evaluation of the quality of our experience." So we're just continually miserable. We're continually revisiting and just this onward, downward spiral. Then we have Mark Twain. "I've been through lots of terrible things in my life. Some of them actually happened."
That's good.
And from Shantideva: "Why worry? If you can do something, do it. If not, how can worrying help you?" Which I buy into completely. And so that's really the first substantive chapter of the book. And everybody should get the book and read it. And we're going to go through some more videos, but at this point, I'm turning it over to Marjorie to go through her Jungian astrology. Now, do you want me to go to the to the website here? This one?
Yes. Is that,
Okay, so
screen
hold
share?
on. I'm just going to do a share screen here. Now this is, oh, we lost Stephen. Here we go. Here he comes. So now this is, I just want to point out to you, this is our website. So we have home and so forth, syllabus, the resources, science, religion, Jung, art. Now we have a brand new thing Marjorie's created called the blogosphere. And that's what she's going to go through here.
We're going to have an ongoing series of blogs. They'll be regularly updated. And Bart will be doing a couple, and I'll be doing a few. So far, I have 3 different ones going. So this is just a bit of a taste of, oh, I have to wear my blue glasses. When the medium is cool, I have to wear blue glasses. Otherwise, I have to wear red glasses to read. But so these are new. This is just kind of a placeholder. This section, you get a little taste, a little teaser, and then read more if you want to. So this one is just kind of a placeholder from something I wrote. It's a copy of something I wrote years ago in 2009. So that's all we've got for some of these. Some of these are, this is a guy that Bart and I were both surprised that we had both read many years ago, decades ago, and loved. That might be a discussion for another day. He just wrote all about the Fibonacci sequence and nature and mathematics. He was a mathematician and a naturalist, and he had a theory of evolution that came slightly after Darwin's that was a real contrast to Darwin's, that I wrote about for a textbook in 2002. And that was one of the most enjoyable assignments I ever had, I have to say, doing the research and the writing for that. This is an old essay of mine that I dusted off on the astrology of relationships. That was one of the things I really enjoyed. It's extremely complicated to do relationship work with real astrology because you're looking at the two charts in their entirety. So that's 10 planets for each person. And how all, you need charts, you need a computer definitely, and you need charts to print out how the 10 planets are interacting together. But it's fascinating, I think. And this is the one that we're going to talk about tonight. Because we're following up with the discussion from a couple of weeks ago on the question of free will. So it may be ironic that I'm an astrologer and I'm saying I do believe we do have free will, not carte blanche, not absolutely free will. And I think there are real limitations, but I think we actually have more than we might like to think, because that gives us more responsibility. So even as an astrologer, I do believe there is a certain, path of least resistance, let's say, that is fated. So we're going to go into this section, which I just created. It's been a couple of weeks in the making. And so here's my little joke: when you see a fork in the road, take it. And that's from Yogi Berra Rinpoche. Yogi Berra really did say that. It was actually about the route to his house, which had a fork in it. But the actual situation was you could take either fork and it didn't make much difference. So that's why he said that. He meant you could take either one and you would still end up at his house. So anyway, this is what I want to say about, and I hope it engenders more discussion. I thought we had a really great discussion a couple of weeks ago. Rather than merely predicting your future following some kind of pre-programmed default mode, the true power of a consultation with a qualified Jungian astrologer lies in its ability to reveal perhaps hidden opportunities within your given inclinations as outlined in your astrological horoscope or birth chart. The snapshot of our planetary solar system against the backdrop of the constellations, or the so-called fixed stars, at your exact moment of birth is said to show your likely life patterns and personality dynamics. However, this kind of insight-based approach actually expands the scope of your free will, I would say, within your given probabilities, empowering you to become a more conscious co-creator of your own future. At least that's my intention. A horoscope does not show our future written in stone, and no responsible astrologer would ever claim that it does. What a horoscope does show, the tendencies and potentials of our inherent personality patterns, those are there, for better and or for worse, as they are also likely to unfold in time, as represented by the cyclical movements of the planets. But these inclinations and likelihoods are not absolutely guaranteed, but neither can they be completely eliminated. The personality, like the body, is a vehicle for the soul, and it's not meant or able to be completely bypassed or transcended. We are not here on earth by accident or mistake. However, we do not have to slavishly follow our path of least resistance either. Finding the middle path can become a co-creative and ever-evolving dance. In other words, while we cannot control the prevailing winds, no matter how enlightened we may become, we can learn to set our sails, and we can learn to tack, potentially radically changing where we end up in life, especially inwardly, even given the outlines set forth in our horoscopes. We can also learn to work in sync with the divine timing of our karmic lessons, perhaps even turning challenges into opportunities for spiritual growth at the very least, rather than being completely broadsided by inner and outer weather conditions that are somewhat predictable and transmutable. The root of divination is divine. An insightful astrologer can help catalyze your individual process of unfoldment, regardless of whether you are facing easy or difficult cycles, pointing out any upcoming pitfalls you will likely be facing, along with optimal opportunities for growth and consciousness during both challenging cycles and fortunate or expansive cycles, which might otherwise be wasted, supports your spiritual development over time and helps you achieve your highest potential, which is also shown in the birth chart. Human life being what it is, we can often see, particularly with 2020 hindsight, that we tend to grow the most during or following our most intensely challenging experiences and relationships. This is why seasoned transformational astrologers encourage living life to its fullest with all its ups and downs as a full contact sport rather than from the sidelines as a spectator or bystander, much less a passive victim. Here's a little quote. When the heart grieves for what it has lost, the spirit rejoices for what it has found. That's a Sufi proverb. Jungian astrologers believe that astrology works on C.G. Jung's principle of synchronicity, rather than just linear cause and effect. This means that celestial events are happening at the same time as human experiences on Earth in parallel, like gears moving within gears. The microcosm is thought to be unfolding within the macrocosm on respectively higher and lower levels, rather than planetary movements directly causing earthly events, in the same way that gravity causes an apple to fall to the ground. And so you'll get the link to this article, and this is a link. There's links in the article. This is a different website, artsofthought.com, which I thought had a pretty good article on Jung's theory of synchronicity. This is a wonderful story. We touched on this story. He was working with a client who was very left brain and very literal minded. And he thought she was just going to have a really difficult time learning to think more symbolically. And as they were talking in one of their first introductory sessions, there was this sound of something hitting against the window screen. And she was talking about a scarab. And it turned out that that's what was knocking against the screen, was a scarab from outside, and not a usual one that you usually see in Switzerland. And it did help her open up to different realms. So there's a picture of him sometimes I'm just astonished to think that he was born in 1875. And I had completely forgotten that he died as early as 1962. Because I always wondered if he knew about the work of the people who wrote Hamlet's Mill, and that was published after he died, so he didn't. So as I'm saying, things work like in levels of the microcosm and the macrocosm and inside each other, like gears. And whenever I think of that, I think of this image of Kepler's, actually. These are, he felt the Platonic solids could be associated with the planetary orbits, and those could be thought of as spheres within one another. And that's also a concept in Kabbalah, that when you look at the tree of life, that's just from one perspective, that's a side view. If you looked at it from overhead, you would see the circles within circles, or the spheres within spheres. So I love this image. So as above, so below is another way of saying that. There are correspondences between the multiple levels of the holographic universe we live in, which Jungian astrology describes in symbolic language as the archetypal themes at work over a lifetime, as well as the more immediate forces in evidence in shorter periods of time. But a symbolic language is not a simplistic equation of this equals that. By definition, a symbol has many possible meanings, and astrological symbols have many possible interpretations and expressions in real life terms. This is where some degree of free will is thought to lie, in our ability to shift the specific expressions of the energies involved, particularly from a less conscious level of expression to a more conscious level, by working at it. The principal way of working at it is through taking up serious spiritual studies and practices, and learning to make more conscious decisions in situations where we actually may have more choice than we may realize on our own. Along these lines, each planet has a distinct column of possibilities. Mars, for example, whether in an individual, little typo there, an individual or national or a corporation's horoscope, or transit or progression chart, does not necessarily have to signify war, violence, anger, aggression, or competition, although it may. However, Mars can also represent action, drive, ambition, hard work, effort, and willpower. To some extent, to quite a large degree, actually, within our work and discipline, we can choose the level of expression of the martial energy within its given range of possibilities. What we cannot choose is to turn Mars energy into Venus energy or Saturn energy. We can't change columns. In and of itself, Mars is never going to translate into Venusian love, beauty, charm, or harmony, or Saturnian discipline, focus, or commitment. One of the highest expressions of Saturnian energy is wisdom, but that is usually achieved through hard-earned experience, another Saturn concept, and not conferred automatically. So you can't see that in the chart. In combination with these other archetypal energies, wow, though, the sheer force of Mars can move mountains and build magnificent cathedrals when it is consciously directed and shaped. Mars, positively tempered by Saturn, connotes skill and sharpening. Or in a less evolved stage, this combination can be like having one foot on the gas and the other on the brakes, in a frustrating stop-go pattern. When the two energies are working together intelligently, on the other hand, it is said to result in gradual, guided, and controlled progress. So you click here to see some sample keywords associated with, for example, Mars, Venus, and Saturn from my instructional workbook to be shared in upcoming classes, to see what it means to have columns of possibilities for these thematically arranged real-life planetary expressions. You can also begin to see the commonalities among planet signs and houses and how they correspond to one another. With the north and south nodes of the moon, we work with 12 planetary energies associated with, or quote, ruling, quote, 12 signs and 12 houses. So they are not 36 random factors, but 3 sets of 12 interrelated factors to learn and commit to memory to start building your fluency in this eloquent symbolic language. So here are some sample pages from the booklet. This is what I mean by the columns of possibilities. So for Mars, all of these keywords, it's not exhaustive, it's just a sample list, relate to Mars. So what I believe, what I was taught and what I observe is that we have some latitude within these possibilities. Having a strong Mars can make you a warrior, whether with words or ideas or literally. It can make you a police officer. It can also just make you assertive. So there's possibilities within that column, within these possibilities. Mars corresponds to or rules Aries, so they're very similar. There's some overlap in the qualities associated with each, and they both correspond with the first house, which has, similarly overlapping symbolism, which you can go back to on your own time. And a lot of these concepts are considered to be opposite of Venusian qualities. And Venus rules Taurus, and also, by the way, Libra, which is another, I didn't include that. It's another whole story. But here, as opposed to sex or violence, Venus rules love, beauty, romance, women, whereas Mars tends to rule men, or masculine energy. And with Taurus, we see a lot of similar principles. So I would say, if you have a strong Mars, depending on the sign that it's in, if it's in a Venus-ruled sign, it's going to have some more Venusian qualities. But the default mode is that it's going to be very different energy at your fingertips from the qualities of Venus. They might both be strong in your chart, and then you might have both sides of that. You might be a complicated, contradictory kind of person. But just for simplicity's sake, let's say you have a strong Mars and not a strong Venus, you're probably going to be less of a people pleaser and more assertive than the average person with a strong Venus or strong Taurus energy. As I said, it gets interesting when you have both. And then for another sample, here's Saturn, with Saturn's possibilities and the kinds of principles that it rules. Saturn has to do with limits because of the rings around it. It's said to kind of visually represent a boundary, and because it's the last planet that we can see with the naked eye. Sometimes you can see Uranus, but it's classically, it's the 7th planet and the last one that's visible to the naked eye. So it represents limitation and restriction, austerity, things like that, delays and obstacles. It represents discipline and control rather than activity, which that's more a Mars quality. But you can see how they can work together. You might have Mars and Saturn in aspect to one another in your chart. And as I said, it can be like one foot on the gas, the other foot on the brakes. It can be a frustrating combination. Or if they learn to work together, which hopefully happens over time and with consciousness, you can learn to bring those two impulses together to be complementary rather than contradictory. So that's really the way it works. And you start to see how complicated it is when we're looking at, as I said, with the north and south moon node of the moon. We look at 12 planetary energies. We count the nodes as almost like planets. They're just a point. And they're within 12 signs, within 12 houses. So this is a hint for anybody wanting to study astrology. If you want to go together and actually learn the actual mechanics of it, that's something that we could potentially do. And here's a tool that I've used with students that really helps. These are 12-sided dice, which have the planets on one die, the signs on another, and the houses on a third. So I've got them here somewhere.
And they've got nice blow-ups there. See,
Yeah,
on Amazon. See.
yeah. So you roll these, you ask a question and you roll them.
Just go, yeah, just go close to the die. Open it. Yeah. there. See,
And yeah, now you can really see them. Thank you. So we could order these, all of us, and it really speeds up the learning process to use it as an oracle. You can ask a question and cast the dice and then learn to interpret the answer using, just go back, using this workbook with these keywords. So that's really how it's set up to work. And what I recommend is making a copy of these pages and then cutting them in thirds, in strips and thirds. You fold it in thirds and then cut out each column so that you can mix and match them. Because Mars doesn't usually end up in Aries, it's usually in some other sign. So as you're learning, you can mix and match and combine them and generate your own interpretations rather than trying to memorize them from books. This is a way to create your own understandings and interpretations based on these concepts of these keywords. So that's a possibility if people want to go deeper into it. And I'm kind of feeling like I could stop for tonight and we can pick up next week. I go into an example, unless people are really dying to keep going, we can keep going tonight. I have an example of learning to work with, if you have strong martial energy in your chart, and let's say you're experiencing more anger than you want to, there's ways to work with it that aren't just suppressing it or squelching it, because it usually comes up in some other way that might be even worse. But there are ways to become more conscious in your relationship with the hand that you've been dealt, I guess is how I would say it. that you don't have to just submit to your fate and live it out in misery. You can learn to express it more consciously, but not by fighting it, not by opposing it directly.
So I have
So
a
this-
question
Sure.
based on your presentation, because I've never really seen astrology as, I mean, the die is very interesting that you would ask a question, throw the die, and from the response get some answers. I've never really, I think of tarot that way. I think of I Ching that way, but I don't think of astrology that way at all. I've never experienced someone saying, okay, well, let's cast some die and get an answer for a question that you may have. I've always seen astrology as being more influential, where are you currently with respect to the energies that are going on. So maybe you could describe that a little bit more, because it's unique to me.
Okay. Well, what you're saying is the usual approach is to look at the chart of, it could be the creation of a company, or an endeavor, or a birth chart for a person, or a work of art. And you're usually looking at the characteristics that are in place at the time of creation, or first breath for a living creature. So that's true. These die, will give you different, you could use 2 or 3 sets of them, and that would give you and I actually recommend that when you're studying, just to open up your interpretations. That's really what I suggest it's used for. But there is such a thing as horary astrology. Have you ever heard of that?
I've heard of it, but I haven't explored it at all.
Okay. It's Horary, horary. That means like hourly. And you can cast a chart for a given question from the moment that you ask the question. And then you look at the chart and see what is going on in the chart, and try to, divine an answer from that. That's kind of the closest to what these astro dice are.
Yeah, okay.
They're not astrology per se. They're just working with the symbolic language of astrology as another form of divination. It is more like the I Ching in that way. It's not. It doesn't have anything to do with the actual planets and stars in the sky.
Right. I just found that really interesting, and thank you for the explanation.
Okay.
Marjorie, I have a question for you. This is related to you're talking about, first breath. So I just had this image in my mind of this woman who is about to give birth. And there are many situations where typically for medical reasons, the birth is either induced or delayed. So given that situation, if a chart for the newborn baby were taken for, okay, well, if he's born today, this is the chart. If he's born the day after tomorrow, that's the chart. Let's wait till the day after tomorrow because it's a much better chart. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, I could imagine somebody doing that. That is called electional astrology. And, I consider it cheating. But, I'm sure there are people who would do that kind of thing. My feeling about, like, say, cesarean, a lot of people have, the question about, well, does it count if it's artificial? There are some people who feel it's not good to do that because it does interfere with the time. I say the first breath is still the first breath. And the moment that it actually occurs is the moment that it actually occurs. So any other possibilities are just other possibilities. In normal circumstances, the fetus actually triggers the labor process. They release hormones that create the reaction in the mother to have the contractions to induce the birth. That doesn't usually happen until the fetus releases the proper hormones. So it's felt that it's actually determined by the fetus, not by the mother or the doctor. But yeah, there are more and more artificial births now, and some people feel that that's problematic. Hindu astrologers actually work with the moment of conception, and Hindu people feel that they are very genuinely aware of it, that the woman can feel the conception, and they try to plan for it. The Hindu couples work in that way. That's called electional astrology. They try to cheat the event and to have a child with the qualities that they are looking for. So there are people who think a lot about that kind of thing.
In a totally different vein, if you look on the web, you'll find that it appears all of the Apollo moon missions, all the manned missions, the launch dates were all determined through astrology. They were not accidental.
I thought that they were determined based upon the revolution, the relationship of the planets and all of that.
That's in there too, but you have different times when you can launch, and the one that they picked was the one that was most favorable astrologically. That's all true.
They would tend to go together. I think they also really try to work with the gravitational pull of the moon, don't they, to get kind of a slingshot?
So the slingshot is when you launch from Cape Canaveral, you end up launching to the east, and you do that because the Earth is spinning to the west. So you pick up 1,000 miles an hour right there doing that. That's the slingshot.
Okay. I thought they also tried to loop around the moon and then.
Well, they do that too, but
Okay.
that's just just a loop.
Okay.
On a different level, if to whatever degree it is, quote, all meant to be, based upon whether you think it's astrological things or whatever else might be at play, there wouldn't be an ability to really cheat, because it would all end up with the results that are going to happen, anyway.
Right. Ultimately, whatever happens is whatever happens. So it doesn't really matter. It's still synchronicity. It's still, when it's, when the synchronicity is right for it, when everything in the universe is aligned, which I think we can see the tip of the iceberg of that in a horoscope. But that's because I believe that there's a lot more unity to the universe than we normally think of in the West, anyway. We really like to think of ourselves as being completely free spirits. And as I said, I think I'm unusual. My second teacher didn't consider herself Jungian at all. She liked Jung. She was familiar with his work, but she felt it was almost redundant or another layer that wasn't really necessary. But she was very much a transformational astrologer. And so that may sound like a contradiction in terms, but she felt, our job is to see what the tendencies are, what the patterns are, and then learn to work with those spiritually and creatively. And she was a Quaker and a Sufi at the same time, and has managed to combine that for many years. We're pretty close on Facebook these days. I asked her if she'd like to talk to us at some point, and she was interested, but her husband was just going in for heart surgery at the time that I was asking her. But he did very well. She was also a painter, an abstract expressionist painter, and he was a intellectual property attorney in New York, and I gather that's how they met. And I think through, I might have also been through, I think they were part of the same Quaker community, and I do believe he now practices the Sufi practices with her as well. So I've always had a kind of bias toward Sufi mysticism as well as Kabbalah. And years ago, probably a couple of centuries ago, they used to cross-pollinate. They got together all the time, and they loved to exchange ideas. And the Jews will say that they influence the Sufis, but not the other way around. But the Sufis say it was mutual. So that's my understanding, that it was a mutual influence. But, a lot of similar concepts mystically, and a similar sense of the unity. So it's a complicated question. Where is the unity? Where is the predestination? And where does that end? And where are we, acting under our own volition, or just conditioning, or just, it's not as simplistic as just saying, well, all Pisces are the same, because obviously they're not. It's not that simplistic, but it's saying that you're going to have these given tendencies if you're born on this date at this time. And from what I've seen, I went into it as a skeptic. From what I've seen, if you look at what it really is saying, which is a lot more complicated than the sun sign columns that you could, see in newspapers and magazines, that's not what astrologers are saying. If you look at what astrologers really are saying, it does tend to be true. But I never saw the point, like I was never particularly interested in the statistical work going on. I was familiar with it. I knew about it. There were times when I, took a required class in it, and, was familiar with particularly Gokul and his work. But I didn't think that it was going to tell anybody anything that they didn't already know. It's just looking at the very grossest features of the horoscope. It's very, it's very crude. The real art of interpretation is a lot more subtle and complex. And I think that's where you get insights that might actually be helpful. And that's the idea. I don't need to tell people what they already know. Hopefully I'm telling them something that they might suspect, or what I say is it should ring true to you. It may be something that you're kind of afraid to think, you might feel it's too inflated or too good to be true to really think it through all the way, but it should have a familiar ring. It should be the kind of thing that you have thought about. It should be validating. It shouldn't be, something completely off and new. But hopefully it gives people, this would be what part 2 would be, creative ways of working with the tendencies so that you can reframe it and approach it in a different way with more consciousness and thinking creatively to have at least a better relationship with what's going to happen. And some transits are devastating, frankly. Pluto to your moon, that's the farthest planet that we work with, that we know of. And the moon is considered to be even more personal than the sun, because it's moving more quickly and it's our emotional makeup. So Pluto to your moon, it's very slow because Pluto moves so slowly. You know, it's in a playing relationship for 5 years and then a separating relationship for another 5 years. So it's 10 years. It's an incredibly long, slow cycle. And everybody born around the same time has Pluto in the same place. So it's very generational too. But the symbolism is going to be different for different people. Not everybody's going to resonate to the same possibilities in that column. Some people get almost every single possibility. Some people just get one or two in their conscious experience. But so that's what I'm saying is I do believe as we work on our consciousness, sometimes I think there's a boomerang effect with that, or a payback that the more conscious you become, in a way, the higher the dues are that you're expected to pay karmically. That's one of my questions. I don't have a definite answer, but it's something that I'm inclined to think. But not everybody who has the same aspect in their birth chart or the same aspect by transit is going to have the same experience of it. There's still room for individuality, but it's going to be within those possibilities. You know, for example, I had a client once who was a twin, and she was a Taurus, and she was convinced that she had all the positive traits of Taurus, but her sister had all the negative traits of Taurus. And that was just, you know, what she chose to believe about it. But so, I mean, it was kind of sophisticated that she thought that they could have different traits and, you know, different qualities, but she knew that they were both Taurus. But she said, she's all about the money. That's all she cares about. I don't care about money. You know, I care about art, and, you know, so those are different possibilities for Taurus. And she's right about that. But I just doubted that her sister had all the negative qualities and she had all the positive qualities. But it could be that way, you know, if that makes sense. So I'm kind of trying to give people a taste so you can decide if you want to go further, if it's worth it to you. I studied for a year being completely agnostic. And I wasn't convinced after a year. I was just convinced that it was interesting enough to keep going. And I studied it for 3 years before I was convinced, really, that there was something to it.
Marjorie, just in terms of, you're talking about all of the positive or negative Taurus features. There are those that would think having all of the money inclination is a very positive thing compared to the artsy inclination, and there are clearly those that think the opposite.
Right.
The question for me is about value judgments. Is it just descriptive of you know, of people's inclinations, or is it pardon me, is it making judgments about it?
Right. Well, you know, Jung would say wherever there's a judgment, there's a projection. So that tends to be my thinking. So wherever you're judging people, whether it's yourself or somebody else, there's probably a projection behind it, for better or for worse. There's really never a reason to be judging. Maybe I fool myself, but I try to have discernment, but maybe I'm fooling myself that there's really any difference there. But, you know, I see things as healthy or unhealthy, rather than just strictly good or bad or good or evil. I feel like those judgments are mostly too big for me to make, I guess. The past 10 years, I've seen some real evil that was indisputable, and it wasn't doing anybody any good, you know. But that's kind of extreme. I think for the most part, we're living in more of a gray area, thankfully. So there's a part 2 where I go into examples of how somebody with a strong Mars, I just picked that as a, there's positive and negative expressions for all planets and all the aspects, and it's not that simple. And even Dante in his time knew that. In his time, the thinking was that Jupiter was the greater benefic and Venus is the lesser benefic. And Mars was the lesser malefic and Saturn was the greater malefic. But he said in his writings that either one could go either way. Too much Jupiter isn't a good thing. That could be obesity or it's growth. So it could be completely unchecked growth. And it is actually an indicator for cancer, Jupiter. So, you know, it's not necessarily a good thing. So I'm just saying, even Dante in his medieval context knew that kind of thing. So there were always people who were more sophisticated and thinking more subtly. But one of the ideals would be the two together. Jupiter in general rules expansion and growth, which are generally considered to be positive things, particularly in the West. And Saturn, as I said, is constriction and control. But together you get slow, steady growth. You know, so that's something to look for in a business chart, for example, because unchecked growth can be terrible for a business too. They might not be able to keep up with it. You know, so you'd rather see some Saturn in there with the Jupiter. And then the Jupiter can help open up Saturn, which can tend to get stuck and be too cautious and too strict, whereas the two together are said to be a really good combination. So there's different schools of thought, there's different approaches, there's a lot of room for interpretation. But as I said, Saturn's never going to be Jupiter, Jupiter's never going to be Mars, and Mars is never going to be Venus. There might be some overlap, but I don't think our free will is in that direction. I think our free will is in how we choose to express each one within its columns. But we have to kind of stay in those columns.
Okay.
So think about how far you want to go. And we can do part 2 of this discussion next week. And I was going to talk either next week or the following week about Mercury retrograde, which people hear about. And there's ways you can learn to work with that to your advantage too. And that's something that affects everybody at the same time. Not in the same way, because it depends on your individual chart, but it's something that we could, the next one is coming up in September. So if we did a little preparation now, we could look at it together at the time and see what's happening for everybody and how we feel, whether there's anything to it or nothing to it.
Okay. So,
And now for something completely different.
yeah, we're going to go back to Stephen's question of we seem to have 3 spatial dimensions, and there's 1 temporal dimension. And why in the world would we ever need more than these 4 dimensions? So just to start with, if we had more dimensions, we could have more energy in these other dimensions, and energy would be measured, for example, by vibrations. This is what I believe people call the music of the spheres, that this energy resonates. Ron Cowan, ended up doing a lot of observations in these realms, and he would end up stopping for example, a subquark of some sort or an electron, because he said they were just incredibly noisy. They were vibrating at incredible speeds. The electron has actually, if you actually look at the electron, it might be moving along a particular path, but it's actually jittering around that path. And if you look at the jittering that occurs around it, the electron is running around that path at the speed of light. And the Heisenberg called this Zitterbewegung, or jitter motion. So there's all kinds of vibrations or activities that are happening, and not simply our dimensions, but potentially higher dimensions. You end up with things, for example, suppose I have empty space. Is there any energy in empty space? Or to put it differently, is there any gravity in empty space? If I had gravity, there'd be energy. Well, what Einstein said was that if you have space that's curved, as long as it's curved, that generates gravity. And so empty space can generate energy. Crazy as it sounds. And that's consistent with what Ron Cowan observed, where he saw that empty space actually not only had energy, but it had the compartments of space had these information blocks in them, and the walls of the space compartments that were constantly scanning what was going on around them. So the scans by themselves generate energies, and so it goes. So now let's go back to why we're saying this, okay? They've now realized, after 500 years of what would be called modern science, that they've only been studying 5% of the universe, and the remaining 95% is there, and it's called dark. So 27% is dark matter and 68% is dark energy. So the dark energy is felt to be what is causing the universe to expand. All of the observations we've seen over the last 100 years show that everything is racing away from everything else. This is the so-called Hubble redshift, shifting to the red part of the spectrum. And that this dark energy is what doing it. Well, the dark energy, if it's 68%, that's 13 times all the matter energy that we have here around us. So where in the world is all this dark energy? And where is this dark matter? It appears to be around us, but the argument is that we need more dimensions to have these things tacked away. And the interesting thing to me is that the matter and the dark matter only interact by gravity, or by this so-called weak force, which is a type of radioactivity. That's where we get radioactive half-life from. But the dark matter has no electrons, so there's no electromagnetism, there's no strong force there. It's much more quiet, is how Ron Cowan observed it. The dark matter is much more quiet or quiescent. So let's go back and try and look at some physics. Einstein showed that energy is proportional to mass. We remember this equation, E equals mc squared. However, there was another physicist, Max Planck, who observed that energy is proportional to the frequency, to the vibrational frequency of whatever it is we're dealing with. And so energy is actually proportional to frequency and mass is proportional to energy. So mass is proportional to frequency is what we get out of this. And what it appears is that in the space subspace that we're familiar with 3 dimensions for space and 1 for time, we have matter around us and it's vibrating. We can see this, we can cool it down so it doesn't vibrate as much. We can heat it up so it vibrates a lot more. In a totally separate subspace next to us, there's this dark matter that's doing its vibrations. And then we have our electromagnetism at the so-called bosons or photons, and they bounce around in all 26 of these dimensions. They're not constrained anywhere. So let's just take a look a little bit more at this. And I'm going to look at, there's a book I'm going to reference on extra dimensions. And then there's 2 books by a mathematician, Xingtang Yao, of the he's the Yao of Calabi Yao. Calabi proposed that certain types of manifolds would exist, and Yao proved that they did indeed exist, and has had a huge impact on mathematical physics. And so let's just start to look at these other dimensions. Appear to be compactified. They appear to be just kind of rolled up around us. So I'm going to walk you through what rolled up means. What does compactified mean? So the thing to keep in mind is we had these 6-dimensional subspaces there for dark matter and for matter. And then we had a synchronizing 6-dimensional Calabi-Yau subspace that hooked up to each of the 2, 1 for the matter and 1 for the dark matter. So since I have 6, actually what I'm going to argue is that there's actually a pair of 2 3-dimensional subspaces. One of them is just simply multiplied by the square root of -1. So if I looked at a point in the x-axis in one of these compactified dimensions, and I'll go out here on the bottom left to this point at 3, and then I looked at in the other dimension. That's because of the wonderful mouse that we have.
Try to hold still.
Where did it go? Here it is down here. And then the other one is multiplied by the square root of -1. Okay. So we have these two different things, but they're actually going to be one single complex dimension. So how are we going to explain that? Let's take a look at, on the right, we have a picture here showing a sphere of radius 5. And so if we looked at a point on the sphere, say at 5, real part is 5 and the imaginary part is 0, then we multiplied 5 by the square root of -1, then that's the same as just taking us up here 90 degrees. It gets rotated 90 degrees up here, and this is 5 times the square root of -1. If I multiplied it by square root of -1 again, it takes us around here, down here to -5. So that's a separate point. If I did it one more time, it takes me down here to -5 times the square root of -1, and a fourth time it takes me up to here. So every time I multiply by the square root of -1 is the same as rotating something by 90 degrees. In this, it looks 2-dimensional, but it's actually one complex plane, one complex dimension, if you will. So let's start with that. Let's keep this in mind, and let's go over here. Now here's our x-axis going down the center of this tube. The x-axis going down the center of this tube, but the tube has wrapped around it this complex dimension, which I've unrolled here, and it shows up as a flat plane. So this flat plane here is actually 2 more real dimensions, or one complex dimension that's wrapped around the dimension x that we see around us. And similarly, we do that for y and z, and that gives us 9 spatial dimensions, one for x with the compactified dimension wrapped around it, one for y, one for z, and then we have time. And so if we simply looked at this, if we had our axis projected here on the right, it looks to us just like a single axis, but if we stared at it real hard, we'd see this other thing is wrapped around it, is compactified or wrapped around it. And this is the argument why we can't see these things. Now, what goes with this is, remember that there are holes in these compactified spaces. So the matter subspace, which was 6 real dimensions, actually has 3 holes in it. The dark matter subspace had 4 holes in it. And the synchronizing space of 6 dimensions had 8 holes in it.
You should have our diagrams up there.
Well, I'm just trying to motivate the holes. The
But
holes
it would make more sense.
the holes can be, well, we can go back to that if, hold on.
Yeah, see if you can get those.
Bart, can I interject some questions, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
So first of all, the square root of -1, and please correct this perception. My understanding is that's kind of an artificial ploy, because there isn't a real square root of -1.
No, if you remember from grade school days, middle school days, if you wanted to solve a quadratic equation of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, you want to solve that, it requires that you have to have complex numbers. Real numbers don't do it. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity.
Okay, well, that's not totally clear to me, but to go on from there, using your wraparound XYZ axes, it strikes me that there would be at the base of these axes a place where the wraparound would intersect, that they are not all completely discrete. There's sections that strike one another, or are connected somehow.
But you think, I mean, remember the coordinate system we're using here, it's an arbitrary coordinate system. That is, there's no, I'm just drawing these things as axes, but do you see any axes around you? I don't see any. You're on mute, Steve. You're on mute.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to, in the most fundamental way I'm able to, try to utilize whatever knowledge I have thus far, gathered to make it, work with what you're saying. So it's just hearing. There's one thing just hearing what you're saying, and it's another thing being able to absorb it as something like, oh, I get that. I'm hearing it, but it doesn't jive with any concepts I've already been able to integrate.
No, that's a good point. I'm just trying to answer your question by going backwards. That do I really need these extra dimensions? Well, I have all this energy all around me, and we've only been dealing with 5% of it for 500 years, and the rest of it must be somewhere. And so I'm going to postulate that it's in these extra dimensions. Okay, I'm just going to, where did it go? And it could be all around us, but it's in these other dimensions, and I'm not there. I'm not in those other dimensions. So starting from that, and then starting from these ideas that mass and frequency are proportional to one another. So and most of the energy that we're talking about here, remember, is this dark energy that is driving space itself to expand, to constantly have everything pushing away from everything else, which I can't imagine what the strength of that is. It's inconceivable how you could push space apart, but that's what's underlying all this, to come up with some rationale for having these extra dimensions, and then going to this formalism of the geometry of 26 dimensions, which leads to the formalism of string theory, of having vibrating strings that are the things that are creating all this crazy energy and all these different dimensions. That's the basic logic for where this stuff came up. What you run into when you try and do this sort of physics is it's very hard to get everything to work out correctly, which is why you have a small number of names like Newton for gravity and Maxwell for electromagnetism and Einstein for general relativity. There's not a long list of people that can play this game and get all these things to work. And it appears that that we just went down the wrong path, and we really do need these extra dimensions. It's not a luxury, just due to be able to physically describe the world around us with all of the different modes of energy that are in it. And that ultimately is described by some sort of quantum theory. The quantum theory is the theory that is of the very small, but it scales up to the very large, to the galactic and intergalactic scales as well.
Would you say it's what you could call a logical necessity? This is the Calabi-Yau manifold. Bart just mentioned Yau. And this is
a six-dimensional Calabi-Yau manifold, but we've got it on this screen. The screen is 2 dimensions. So it's a 2-dimensional slice of a 6-dimensional Calabi-Yau manifold. What you can see in this picture, when you look at this, there's actually some holes in this thing. Okay, so the story is more complicated than just 6 dimensions. The holes are important. The curvature is important. As you dig deeper, you start to find out all the real hair that's going into these things. I just wanted to go back to, hold on, go back to, let me get out of this. Go back to my little talk I put together here. To just make sure I covered everything. Yeah, so the space or the arena that we're dealing in, we had, for matter, we had 10 real dimensions, 6 of which were compactified, and there's 3 holes in there. So Euler, back in the 1700s, Euler came up with something called an Euler characteristic, which is 2 minus 2 times the number of holes. Don't ask me why I was doing this. I'm just trying to show you that the Euler characteristic comes out to be -4 here, -6 here, and -14 for the other one. But the holes all link together in what's going on here. So there's really only 10 real dimensions that we end up with here. And then let me just go forward a little bit more. There's each of these 6-dimensional subspaces has a different curvature. I haven't talked about it, but the curvature is really important because that determines what paths can form. A particularly interesting path is the shortest path between 2 points, and the curvature determines what the shortest path is between 2 points. Hold on one sec. And so what it appears is going on is these other subspaces that we can't see have the possibility of traveling much faster than the speed of light to allow all of the actions that we see to be synchronized. There's no delays that happen here, and they're all complex. And I'm just looking to see if I covered everything. Yeah, the only thing that's crazy here was in the dark matter subspace, time runs backwards. We have negative time because of this fact that when you multiply the square root of -1 by itself, you get -1. So here we have our space, x, y, z, and then the natural coordinate is square root of -1 times the speed of light times time. And then we multiply that by square root of -1 or I to get ix, iy, iz, and the speed of light times minus time. So for this dark matter or shadow matter, that is what Ron called it, Ron Cowan, time is actually running backwards. And I have no idea why that's the case. So this is our picture again, and this is my attempt to answer Stephen's question. And with that, I'm going to shut up.
Bart, I've got a few more questions just to try to gain, some semblance of clarity about this. So I'm not sure if vector is the right word, but would you call X, Y, Z axes vectors?
No, those are just the coordinate. A vector is something that goes in a direction. So it could be 3 units in the X direction, 2 units in the Y direction, minus 1 unit in the Z direction. So the vector has those. I look at the end of the vector, okay, with respect to what I just said.
Well, I was thinking of it just in terms of thinking of length, width, and depth. So if I'm thinking of X, Y, and Z, I'm thinking of it in those terms. Is that reasonable so far?
Yeah. The one thing to keep in mind is this. Suppose I move the universe over 1 foot. Does anything change? Probably not. Okay. So I can't talk about any specific point like being the origin of the universe, because it couldn't possibly matter.
Could it possibly dark matter?
Well, we don't know enough about dark matter to say.
So the dark matter is not coexisting in the same dimensions as matter. It is in a different dimension.
It's in a different, subspace, a different 10-dimensional subspace. And Ron Cowan observed these as, for us, they're the chakras. We have the 7 major chakras in ourselves. We showed pictures of what these chakras look like. And more than likely, there are also dark matter chakras on each of the astrological entities that we saw. The sun, the moon probably have piles of this dark matter on them. Each of the planets, so that we're on Earth. So there's a notion of Gaia. Okay, that's probably the soul or the spirit of the Earth, which is dark.
The ley lines on the Earth are said to be like chakra lines. Meridians.
They're meridians that connect the chakras together. So it's right next to us, quote unquote. But it's in the problem is no one's measured anything over here. Okay, no one's taken a ruler over to this dark matter subspace, which is right next to us, and measured these 3 dimensions of X, Y, and Z. No one's measured any energy over here. Okay, all of the things that we can do over where we're at, no one's done.
So are you saying that the chakras that we would have within our bodies have an analog that is within space time?
That they're existent in each of the 7 chakras, right up to my crown or my root chakra, that they're all little pieces of dark matter, but they happen to be, if you will, sentient. Okay, the biology still works, evolution still works. So here we have matter over here, and we end up with life. We're talking to each other. Well, the same thing is true for dark matter, and the chakras are in fact alive. They live forever, and the existence proof for this, if you go on the web, is all of the different hypnotists that have done regression hypnosis of people into past lives and have discovered that people have many past lives if you do it in an unbiased manner. If you suggest something to them, people in hypnosis can pick up on it, and then you've biased the whole thing. So you have to watch how you do this. But the chakras apparently live forever, and they incarnate, and then we live with them, and then we die. That this body dies, and they get a new body.
But my understanding is that they're not really here in our physical dimension.
Right.
There's correspondence, like they correspond to an organ that's in the physical body, like the pineal gland and
The heart, the sexual organs, the third eye in the middle of your forehead, your throat for communications, and so forth.
but the actual chakra is not a physical thing.
Well, it's not physical in
this
our
dimension.
10-dimensional subspace. Okay, but people have taken, their pictures people have taken with was it Corellian
Carillion, yeah.
pictures that suggest something, but we're really at an early stage in developing any metrology, any means for measuring anything over here. But hopefully this would be an impetus for people to try and figure out, how in the world do I measure something that's in this other subspace?
What distinguishes space from subspace?
What distinguishes space from
Subspace.
subspace? A subspace makes up, for example, I have 3 dimensions around me. If I have a plane, like a tabletop in front of me, that defines a 2-dimensional subspace. It takes 2 dimensions to describe that, but it's missing the 3rd dimension. That is a subspace.
Okay, so having 3 dimensions, that is a complete space. Having less than 3 dimensions is a subspace.
Yeah, well, or any number. Here we have 26 dimensions. So I just said we have a 10-dimensional subspace for matter, 10-dimensional subspace for dark matter, and a final 6-dimensional compactified subspace. That gives me 26 dimensions.
So our 3 dimensions are a subspace of that 26-dimensional
Right.
space.
But the description was that they are a subspace, but as you said it, Marjorie, it seems like our 3 dimensions are a subspace.
Yeah, your 3 dimensions are a subspace of the 4 dimensions of space and time. Okay, and they're a subspace of the 10 dimensions that we need for matter. And they're a subspace of the 26 real dimensions that we need.
Whenever the number is lower, it's a subset of the larger number.
For a 3-dimensional subspace, I only need 3 numbers to specify any point in that subspace. But it's actually has 23 more numbers because it's in a 26-dimensional space. So I'm not looking at the other 26, at the other 23 numbers. I'm only looking at 3 of them.
I think it's good to study this diagram and the Calabi-Yau manifold and just kind of meditate on it, really.
Well,
Do we have it here?
No, I don't think we have. We have to
It's
go
on
back
that
to the.
other screen. But
Yeah.
you can go to the website or, what we'll send out and just sort of contemplate the shape of the Calabi-Yau manifold. If you, that's a link. If you go to the one on the web that this links to, it's an animation. They have it moving, it's spinning and rotating.
Watch, here it goes.
And this is a different one. But you get kind of more of a sense. They're trying to create the illusion of these additional dimensions in just 2 dimensions.
Now, for whatever it's worth, just so you have some fun, there's probably a little under 10,000 Calabi-Yau manifolds. but there's only a very few of them that have the characteristics that I just showed you, meaning 3 holes, 4 holes, 8 holes, and having the curvature that goes with it. And those are the ones that probably would be the greatest interest to engineers and physicists and mathematicians and chemists. So,
But these are real things that people have been working on for decades.
yeah,
Bart's not just making it up.
yeah, but it's, you know, I'm just trying to motivate why it's plausible that we need these higher dimensions, more dimensions. There's just too much energy out there, and we're in the, how do we describe it? And showing how those Calabi-Yau manifolds vibrate, move around, you know, gives you an idea of space itself is doing some amazing things. Forget having matter in it. This is just the space itself that's going, vibrating all over.
I think space is far more mysterious than we ever imagined.
Well,
Do you have some good images of what Einstein was talking about?
well,
Curvatures?
Einstein showed the curvature side of things, but that's what I wanted to get across was if you have a curved space with no matter in it, that has energy in it. And energy, as Einstein said, is equivalent to matter.
Right.
E
Well,
equals
it's-
MC squared. So what's going on? There's no matter there.
I would say matter is it's more slowly vibrating energy.
Well, it is, but where is it?
Right.
Because all you've got is an empty curved space, but the curvature by itself generates the energy. And you start to see how many different ways, or this is why it was called the music of the spheres, is that in all of these dimensions, you have these vibrations occurring. And you know, from listening to Ron Cowan talk about this, it was beautiful.
And wherever there's a planet, it's bending the space around it.
Right.
It's as if it's sitting on this membrane, you know, like a pool cover. And the big beach ball on the pool cover, it's bending the pool cover into the pool in this like a cone shape around the beach ball. That's really what the planets are doing to the space around them.
And if you're not happy with that, think of a black hole. And so it appears that every one of these galaxies in its core has a black hole. But our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, has a black hole that is 4 billion solar masses. So our sun is 1 solar mass. So it has the mass of 4 billion of our sun. And having said that, it's a hole. Like, where does it go? You know, it's not matter. It's something else entirely. So, but it's curving space like crazy. You better believe it.
Isn't matter really an illusion?
Well, it's what we incarnate as. That's our bodies are what we have.
It does E equal MC squared? Is that theoretically apply to dark matter and dark energy?
No, since no one's ever done experiments to measure energy and mass of dark matter, no one knows.
Then how would you possibly go and say that the universe is only 5% matter if you can't? I mean, how do you quantify the rest?
Well, the way you come up with this is twofold. You look at other galaxies, okay, and you see them. They appear, many of them, to be spinning or rotating around a common core. And so you take a look and you say, well, it looks to me like there's 10 million or 100 million stars there, and they each have, you know, the mass of our sun. So if they're spinning like that, what does that mean? And you can conclude that it's got to fly apart. There's no way it's going to hold together. The only way it could possibly hold together is if there's more matter there than you can account for. And that matter is attracting all of these stars so they can't go flying away out of this spinning galaxy. So that was the first indication people came up with. The second indication was when Hubble looked at how far away these stars are, and realized that he could get a Doppler shift out of them. If they were coming toward us, the light would be shifted toward the blue end of the spectrum. If they're going away from us, it would be the light would be stretched out. It would be to the red end of the spectrum, and everything he saw, everything was stretched out to the red end of the spectrum. Every galaxy was running away from every other galaxy. Okay. Well, what's causing that? That's a totally separate thing from what I just said about looking at the galaxies spinning and holding together. That's why that was called dark energy. And people did some simple calculations on that, and they concluded that that had to be 68% of the universe, and to have enough mass in the galaxies that we had to have 27% of it be this dark matter, and only 5% of it be matter. That's where these things came from. And all those calculations are roughly 100 years old.
And the gravitational force applies to dark matter as well as matter.
Yes, yeah, dark matter attracts to matter, and dark matter attracts to dark matter.
Well, when there is an assessment that this particular star is 100 light years away, that's presuming we're dealing with three-dimensional space, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, if we're dealing with a multi, like 26 or however many dimensions there are, then that three-dimensional equation might be of no practical use because there might be a real shortcut getting there.
Well, that's something else, but you raise a good point. There's a whole new field called gravitational astronomy, okay, where people use gravitation. They don't use simply 3 dimensions, they use the 4 dimensions of space and time. And then they look at how things are jiggling, how the different stars are jiggling out there. And they've been able to now measure what are called gravity waves that are coming out of the curvature of space caused by these different stars. And, for example, if you have a nova, a gigantic explosion, that really warps space and time. And that's what they've been able to measure. Is they've seen a number of novas now, and they've seen a burst of gravitons, which are the quantum versions of gravity waves. And so it goes. So we're just at an early stage of being able to measure in 4 dimensions gravitational waves. We're nowhere near being able to do anything in 10 dimensions, 26 dimensions, forget it. These are early days.
But it's a kind of a structural mathematical conjecture that arrives at these numbers of the dimensions. It's not just.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons to believe this is correct, but there's no evidence, quote unquote, other than what Ron Cowan supplied in his observations that I'm aware of. Okay, but that doesn't mean, there could be 27 other people I never met, and they all confirmed it. Okay, I have no idea. You have to ask yourself, how do you duplicate these observations?
But the mathematicians are the ones coming up with these numbers.
Yeah.
The physicists and the mathematicians. It's not the mystics.
Yeah, and you're seeing an area of act.
And the mathematicians are all trying to disprove other mathematicians.
No, I'm giving you the state of the art right now of what mathematical physics believes is going on. Okay. And the only wrinkle I'm adding to this is I personally like what Wolfram is doing by trying to do all this with algorithms and data structures, these hypergraphs. I think he's onto the most natural representation of what's going on. But even Wolfram would say he's got decades to go. And again, where's the data? Where, as Stephen observed, what meter do you have that shows that there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 dimensions. Where are they? What in the world would you measure to come up with these things? No one knows yet, but that's the question. That's the challenge.
But we could show more. I think we could do another class that shows like the footprints in the sand that point to it being that.
Yeah.
There's logical reasons.
Yeah. No, this is not. It's
It's like if this is so, then this must be
Yeah.
so, then this must be so.
Yeah.
There's a logic to it.
Yeah. The problem is that, again, it's still a game. Okay. Until the thing that separates physics. Physics has many theories, and what they have discovered is that good data shoots down many theories. Don't worry. The theories don't work. So until we get some other data, this is the best we can do. And then we'll improve it.
Marjorie, there was a lot of logic to the theory that the Earth was flat as well. So
Sure. I look out my window, it looks flat to me. So.
There was a story that never goes away for me in terms of trying to conceptualize the universe, and that was this theory that how these little ships from Spain could cross the ocean, and there would be this whole large indigenous population, and there would be these relatively few sailors, and they would be able to take over these a whole large areas, despite how few of them there were compared to the indigenous population. And one of the theories was that these ships could just sail over to a shoreline where these natives were looking out, and the ship was invisible to them because it was beyond their conception that a ship such as that could even exist. And since they couldn't conceptualize that it exists, therefore they didn't see it, so that it had a stealth quality to it.
Right.
And it occurs to me that with that similar kind of reasoning, we can't conceptualize these additional dimensions, and therefore it's hard to see them, to believe that they exist, even if they were literally right in our faces. So I would conjecture that could have some component,
But yeah, the counter to that is that we're not all Michael Jordan. Okay, so Ron Cowan, went ahead and observed these things, and I said, look, this is what I'm seeing, and it's too hard to have a really complicated lie hold together unless it really is true.
Well, I would say this is how the aliens really travel.
Anyway, that's another story.
They
anyway,
fold up the dimensions.
I'm just looking at the time, so I'm sensitive to let people go. But that's my attempt at trying to help Stephen and hopefully other people on this thing. And we can revisit this as I ponder how to answer the question again. But it's a very good question, and I want to thank you for asking it.
Thank you for your help.
Okay, and have a wonderful weekend, everybody. All the best. Bye-bye.
Happy summer.
Yep. Enjoy.
Bye. Happy summer.
Stephen, you still got your iPhone on too.
We
Okay.
hope that's you anyway.
Yeah, we hope it's you. Okay. Bye-bye.
I think it might be one of the aliens.
Bye.
I know.